Good evening and a very warm welcome to Japan House, London. My name's Sam Thorne. I'm Director General here, and it's my pleasure to be introducing this evening's event, Japan's Economic Security and Sensitive Technology Policy. We're thrilled to be working again with the IISS on this event, and thank you, Robert Ward. Great to have you and the team back again. As the first country to implement an economic security policy, Japan has, of course, led the debate in this field. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from tonight's distinguished panel about recent developments in this area. For those of you who haven't visited Japan House London before, we opened back in 2018. We have the mission of presenting the very best of Japanese cultures here in London, working with partners around the capital, up and down the UK and across Europe as well. We have a shop, we have a restaurant, we have a library, a very busy exhibitions program and events program. A couple of events I did want to mention. On Monday, you may be interested in an event we'll be hosting called Governing in the Age of AI. It's fully booked, but it will be live streamed. We have film programs coming up, screening of Tokyo Ga by Wim Wenders, as well as a survey of the work of Shinkai Makoto. Tonight's event will run till about 7:45 and will be finished by a drinks reception. There will also be an opportunity to see our exhibition Looks Delicious. That will be extended through to 8:30. So please do go see that exhibition if you haven't had an opportunity to already. I'm now going to hand over to Robert. Robert Ward is the IISS Japan Chair, as well as the Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the IISS. He writes extensively on strategic issues related to Japan, including its contemporary security and foreign policies. Please join me in welcoming Robert and tonight's panel. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that warm welcome, Sam, and wonderful to be in Japan House again. It's been about a year or so, hasn't it? So thank you and the team for your warm welcome and your support as always. So this is a webinar meeting by the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the event's name is Japan's Economic Security and Sensitive Technology Policy, Strategic Cooperation with the UK and the EU. We're delighted to be hosting this event, obviously, with the kind support of wonderful Japan House and the team here in London's Kensington. To those who are looking online, do drop by Japan House if you have a moment. There's plenty to see here, to experience, and even to buy if you so desire. So a wonderful location and place. I'm pleased to say also that online we have a really global audience today. So a special thank you, as always, to those of you that have got up early or stayed up late to be listening to this session. As Sam said, I'm Robert Ward, and I'm the Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the IISS, and I'll be chairing this event. So economic security, given the intensity of recent geopolitical change, plus, of course, the recent change of administration in the US, which may bring with it major structural change in the global economy, the economic security theme of this event today could not be more timely. One focus of today's discussion within economic security more broadly is in areas of potential strategic cooperation between Japan, the US, the UK rather, and the EU. Japan's been leading the debate in this area and is seen by some as a thought leader in economic security. By way of example of this, at another IISS event back in 2023, Minister of State of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Tobias Lindner, I asked him about German economic security and how that related to Japan. And he said that economic security, and I quote, is a speciality of the Japanese system. So we'll be hearing more about that from our panelists, I'm sure. There are historic reasons why Japan has been a thought leader and an intellectual leader in economic security. But here are some examples of recent developments in the space. In 2021, For example, Prime Minister Kishida created the cabinet post of Economic Security Minister, which was a global first. In 2022, the Japanese government enacted the Economic Security Promotion Act, and I think, Ryo, you did some testifying for that. And in 2024, of course, legislation was passed to expand the security clearance system for protecting sensitive information relating to economic security. One of the pillars of economic security for Japan is sensitive technology, specifically emerging critical technologies with potential dual use in commercial and military applications. Japan's also looking to deepen cooperation in this area with its strategic partners. So audience, I think you're in for a real treat this evening with our exceptional panel, who will help us navigate some of the eddies and currents of economic security with regard to Japan, the UK, and the EU. So a brief introduction from me of our three speakers in order of speaking. So first, to my immediate right, we have Professor Sahashi Ryo, who has flown in from Japan for this event, arrived yesterday, but you're looking pretty up for it, so we're pleased. And a warm welcome to windy and rainy London, of course, Ryo, too. Ryo Sensei is Professor of International Relations at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo. He specializes in international politics in East Asia and sits on Japanese government panels, including, for me, this was an intriguingly named Council on the Actual State of Land Use. So perhaps we talk about that afterwards. And the advisory panel on science and technology diplomacy. Ryo also works as research fellow at the Japan Center for International Exchange and is visiting fellow at the 21st Century Policy Institute. Ryo's most recent book is Asia Rising, a handbook of history and international relations in East, South, and Southeast Asia, on which he was a co-author and which was published in 2024. Our second speaker in the middle is Dr. Alexandra Sakaki, who arrived this morning, I'm relieved to say, from Berlin. Alexandra is Deputy Head of the Asia Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP, based in Berlin. Alexandra's research focuses on Japanese foreign and security policy, as well as Indo-Pacific security dynamics. Previously, she was a visiting researcher at Keio University and the National Defense Academy of Japan. She has authored numerous policy papers and articles, including a new course for Japan's security policy, which was published back in 2023. She was also a brilliant guest on our IISS Japan Memo podcast that we did in the middle of last year on Japan and the EU, and the episode is well worth a listen if you haven't already heard it. And our third speaker is Dr. Francesca Ghiretti, who is based in London, and Francesca is research leader at RAND Europe, where she leads work on China and economic security. Francesca is also an adjunct fellow non-resident at the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And she's also the host of another excellent podcast series, Geoeconomic Competition. Previously, Francesca's worked as a senior geoeconomics fellow at a London-based AI company, and I will be asking you about DeepSeek, so be warned. And an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERICS, which is, again, I think based in Germany. Congratulations, Francesca, on your new book, which we have here, Chinese Investments and the Economic Security Turn in Europe, which was published around 2 weeks ago. So congratulations on that. And lastly, before I give the floor to Ryo Sensei, a couple of housekeeping points from me. Each speaker will speak for about 5 to 8 minutes, after which they and I will have a joint discussion on the issues raised, and then I'll open the floor to questions from our audience. If you ask a question, please state your affiliation when you ask your question. And for those of you online, we'll be using Zoom's Q&A function, which I have here, with the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screens, and you can type in a question whenever you like. But again, please say who you are and where you come from, your affiliation. So, and the whole event will last about an hour. So, Ryo, over to you.
It's on. Okay, thank you very much for kind introduction. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone here and also over the screen. My name is Ryo Sahashi. I'm now teaching at University of Tokyo. But for me, it is always very great honor to come back to UK, Great Britain, because I studied and learned my English in University of Edinburgh back to 25 years ago. So London is kind of easier place for me to travel by bus. So it is my great honor to come back and to speak in front of you at the Japan House London. So for today, for this topic of the symposium, let me speak 3 items. First, I want to explain something about Japan's economic security measures. I believe, what we are doing now under economic security is a kind of good case of advanced economies. I think, Robert just flattering Japan as a thought leader, but maybe, we are kind of good, example of economic security. But actually, we can find out some difference from UK model. And the second thing is, what kind of challenge we have. By having Donald Trump in White House. So this is my second topic. And finally, I briefly want to mention about how UK and Japan should cooperate together towards the future. So first of all, about economic security things, as Robert said, Japanese government and Diet has passed the Economic Security Promotion Act back to 3 years ago. Which I testified in the Diet. And actually, it is still one of the main pillar of our approach to economic security. We have made a legal platform for managing critical infrastructure, critical minerals. We also introduced secret patent. And also, we try to have more technology, try to help support the high advanced technologies under this scheme. And actually, Shigeru Ishiba, our prime minister, just delivered his policy speech in last week in Diet. So in January every year, we started a regular session of the Diet. So in the first day, Prime Minister delivered a policy speech. And under the policy speech, he said economic security, of course, but in the section of economic policy. So actually, this is the very important point for me, because I think many friends here or over the screen might think, economic security is a part of national security umbrella. But I think, of course, in Japan, of course, we have such sense also. But economic security is also for our economic competitiveness, right? Including industrial policy. So in this policy speech last week by our prime minister, he discussed economic security in the section of economic growth. So, but this is just one example. But for us, economic security is not only protecting our technology, but it is also how can we promote our economic growth, and also how can we make a more partnership with other countries towards economic prosperity. So of course, from private companies' perspective, or maybe from UK government perspective, it is something beyond the scope of economic security. Or you want to say, oh, we have to do more emphasis on protection of our technology. That is also very all right, right? We have to pay more attention to research integrity. That is how can we protect our economy, technology from outside, people. But at the same time, it is very important for us. How can we see the competitiveness under economic security? And now in Japan, many government agencies try to have more new measures. And one thing which might be something new is JMOD, Minister of Defense, just launched a new office of Defense defense innovation, they say defense innovation, science and technology center. Actually, it is very small, but Japanese version of DARPA in the United States. So it is something new. They want to have more project manager and also scientists for dual use technology under the scheme of MOD. This is something new. And actually also MOF, Minister of Finance, also want to promote more FDI regulation, but Francesca might discuss something about FDI, so maybe I can follow up in Q&A or discussion session. But we are doing more, measures not only in protecting our economic security, but also promoting our economic dynamism. Okay, so maybe I spent too much time on this, but so about the challenge we have now is, of course, United States. We don't know how Donald Trump will use his trade policy and economic policy. But in short, what we really worry is he may not pay attention to economic security measures, which Donald Trump first administration and then Joe Biden administration has prepared and established. This is what we really worried, right? We work very hard with American government and also other G7 countries and beyond that, but he may not take care of that, right? So this is our concern. The second concern is Chinese economic statecraft. China is not 8 years ago, right? China has now introduced many economic security measures. So, under the big pressure from United States, they may enact, more retaliation measures against, us. Not only against the United States, but also against us, UK and Japan and other EU countries, right? So, they already use materials like gallium, germanium, graphite, and antimony by their regulation. But, it could be more. The list could be longer. So this is our concerns. Finally, UK and Japan should work more. We are really, even though we have some different conceptualization of economic security, maybe, but I think our positioning is really close and really similar in economic security and also in the time free trade is in danger. So I think UK and Japan are really natural partner for not only for traditional security or not only for Indo-Pacific, but also for economic security as the G7 members. So I think I'm really happy to hear a lot of stories about, Japan and UK will do more by launching a new 2+2 mechanism for economic security. It is a really good thing, but I think we should do more. Maybe UK and Japan should launch a kind of global forum for economic security in Tokyo or in London, and maybe other G7 countries and EU countries, can come. We also can teach for American friends what should be the meaning of economic security. But I think UK and Japan should take a more leadership together for a kind of global audience, for having more healthy economic security. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Ryo, thank you for that Global Forum on Economic Security. We have people from the British government here and from the Japanese government. So perhaps this is something that will get some legs, and you heard it here first. So that's excellent. I was interested in your linking of economic security and competitiveness. Perhaps we follow up later on in the discussion. Japan's version of DARPA, again, an important development there. Plus, of course, China itself as an economic security player. So those caught my eye. Alexandra, over to you, please.
Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me for the introduction. Like Sahashi-san, I'm also very happy to come back to the UK. You can see British soft power in this because I also enjoyed my master's education here in this country. I will also speak a bit about Japan, Europe, not just UK, but Japan-Europe cooperation in the economic security field. And I think I will echo some of the points perhaps that we already heard. And I will also address roughly 3 points. First of all, the similarities in approaches, then some differences that I see, and finally also talk about kind of ideas for the common agenda. So obviously on the European side, we can see that European countries have made great strides in economic security policy making in recent years. Just if you look, for example, at the EU level, we have the 2023 economic security strategy that was issued, but also other instruments such as the anti-coercion or investment screening mechanisms. And I see also a great convergence between Japan's approach and European approaches. And I think that has to do with the fact that we have similar outlooks. Both sides are open economies, highly dependent on international trade. We face similar predicaments and questions in the geopolitical tensions that we have. And also, of course, the US-China rivalry is affecting Europe and Japan in similar ways. We are pressured by the US to take similar positions as they are in economic security. And at the same time, we fear retaliation by China. And I think we can also see the convergence if we look at actual policies. So, for example, if you look at the 2023 EU economic security strategy, it covers 4 risk areas. That's supply chains, critical infrastructure, technology security, and economic coercion. And if you put that in comparison to the Japanese approach, I think it covers roughly the same areas. So I think from that perspective, we can see also further commonalities which are important to recognize, and that is that we have some commonalities that are different, that differentiate us from the US approach. And that is that I think the Europeans and the Japanese both very much emphasize the need to strengthen the multilateral rules-based economic order as part of economic security policies. And both also pursue free trade agreements as part of the economic security strategies as a way to diversify economic relationships. And this is, of course, contrary to US policies where they're moving away from free trade agreements and also tending more and more towards protectionism. Europe and Japan also pay much attention to the principle of non-discrimination, I think, in that same vein. So they are adopting country-agnostic regulations that are not focusing on a particular country. Again, this is different from the the US approach that targets very much China in many regulations. So I think these similarities explain why it's high on the agenda between Europe and Japan to work on economic security. But nevertheless, I think it's also important to recognize that there are some differences in approaches. And I'd just like to highlight 2. One very briefly that concerns the EU. We have to, of course, recognize that when the EU is making economic security policy, the institutional structure means that the EU's policy making is much more fragmented. The Commission can set certain goals in economic security policy making, but in the end, many of those policies have to be implemented by the member states, and that we see some divergencies between member states on that. So it's different from the Japanese approach where policies can be set by one country alone. And the second difference, I think, that I see is that Japan, I think, is to a much greater extent than Europe pursuing industrial policies to secure a leading role in the field of critical and emerging technologies. So we know that the US and China is, of course, competing in these areas. But when we look at Japan, Japan has actually been making quite significant investments in building Japan's semiconductor industry, also artificial intelligence, for example. So recently in November, I think Prime Minister Ishiba, in fact, pledged to spend another 10 trillion yen, that's about 61 billion euros, for semiconductors and AI until 2030. The third point on what kind of agenda we have, I think that Japan and Europe really need to further deepen economic security cooperation in the coming years for a number of reasons. First of all, I think geopolitical tensions between the US and China are likely to intensify, putting more pressure on Europe and Japan. So I think it's useful to discuss how to respond to that pressure, both from the US and also from China's market distortions, overcapacity problems, etc. Secondly, I think what we have learned from the economic security policies of recent is the fact that many of those policies can only be implemented if, by a number of states. They're not effective if only one country implements them. So there's a clear need to have more cooperation between the US, between European countries and Japan in how we deal with different instruments. Thirdly, I think we have also increasingly seen a risk in the fact that the definition of economic security is increasingly being stretched or expanded in some countries to kind of pursue domestically driven protectionism. And I think arguably the Nippon Steel case, where the Biden administration prevented the takeover of US Steel, may be a case in point. I think there has been a lot of criticism in Japan of the fact that the definition of national security is being stretched in this case. Finally, perhaps just very briefly, I think it's important to also think about the private sector in this. I think there's some concerns by Japanese companies and also European companies how the regulations of the other side may affect their international operations. So I think it would be useful to think about more venues where we can have 1.5 track or maybe also business to business discussions on economic security. And I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I was struck by your comment on principle of non-discrimination in Europe, EU policy. But economic security is about discrimination, isn't it, in some respects? Perhaps we'll come back to that in a bit. And of course, your point on definition of economic security being stretched, as we talked about on the call a couple of days ago, economic security is voracious. It eats everything that it comes into contact with. So how do you define economic security and where does it sit? Does it sit like in Ishiba's speech in economic policy, or is it in national security policy? So yes, thank you, Alexandra. And Francesca.
Glad you made that comment, because I wanted to start with a piece of an academic exercise of making the difference between what is economic security, what is protectionism, and what perhaps is economic nationalism. But before that, just two quick comments. One is there's a difference between discriminating by geography or discriminating by criteria that apply to everyone. So I guess that is one of the fundamental differences of a country-neutral vs. A country-targeted approach. And the second point that I wanted to make, it would be great if we could elaborate more on the connection between economic security and growth, because this country, the UK, is going through this growth agenda, and sometimes it feels that the economic security agenda is in tension with the growth agenda, and I don't think that is the case. And Japan here, I think, would be a great teacher. Now, going back to definition. So to me, there are three fundamental elements that differentiate economic security from protectionism. The first one is that, and it goes a bit against what I've just said, but there needs to be an address to a national security concern. Now, this is where the trick is, because then Dresner wrote a very nice piece in Foreign Affairs about the fact that the issue is not that economic security is expanding, but the national security as a concept is expanding and is very flexible. And it goes back to the debate on securitization between people who think the national security has a set criteria, while others think it expands according to the circumstances. So that is why I have two more criteria. The second one is that economic security is selective. So not all transactions and not all industries will be of regard of economic security. And I think this is one of the areas where Europeans, especially, I don't know if Japan has the same issue, have a bit of a problem in prioritizing, in trying to understand what is it that belongs to economic security and what, at the end of the day, may have maybe very long and indirect effects, but it's not necessarily concern of economic security. So you're not trying to protect the entire economy, you are just trying to protect certain areas for economic security reasons. The third aspect, and I'm glad that both my colleagues mentioned this, is that economic security, unlike protectionism, has a multilateral aspect. So you have to collaborate with others in order to enforce, strengthen, and make your economic security real. There's no scenario where a country can do economic security by itself, not even the US, not even China, right? So maybe we can elaborate on that later. Now, the perhaps more tricky differentiation is between economic nationalism and economic security, in the sense that economic nationalism puts the nation, the state, as first priority, which means that collaboration with others becomes secondary, which means that first and foremost, you think about your nation and security becomes secondary. And here is where, for example, some economic security measures, such as some use of FDI even within Europe, may become a little bit more economic nationalism. And I'm wondering if the case of US Steel and Nippon Steel, for example, could be one of these cases. Now, since we've talked about economic nationalism and investment screening, and since I decided to do the interesting thing of writing a PhD on investment screening and then get a book out of it. Currently, so 2023 was a very important year for the European Union. Economic security strategy, critical technologies, launch of the risk assessment, and then January 2024, the package on economic security initiatives, among which the fact that the EU would have eventually reviewed the FDI screening regulation review, which is now happening. And now we have a first draft of the amendments that the European Parliament, the leading rapporteur, Raphael Glucksmann, is going to propose for the regulation. And I honestly thought that these amendments would have been very conservative because there's very little political appetite to push this thing further. But I was incredibly wrong because the amendments are actually quite courageous, maybe even borderline difficult to argue for. The first one is what Noah Barkin defined as the Hamburg Amendment, which basically is the possibility for the European Commission to overrule member states' decision on FDI screening in cases that can pose a risk for the whole of the European Union. So why is it the Hamburg clause? Because when COSCO was acquiring a percentage of the Tollerort terminal at Hamburg, the process of FDI consultation at European level got started. So the Commission gave his opinion to the German government. The opinion we know at this point was not to go ahead with the acquisition, but the German government was in full power to decide not to listen to that and go ahead. So they decided to do that. Now, small parentheses, they did, however, diminish the share of COSCO so that COSCO wouldn't have veto power in the decision of the terminal. But in this new framework, in theory, the Commission could say, no, you can no longer go ahead with this one. The second innovation would be to include positive spillovers into the economy. into the clauses for accepting investments, merger and acquisition specifically, and joint ventures. So I accept this investment, I green light it, but these are the conditions that you have, for example, local supply chains, or that you have this percentage of local workforce, or that you change your board in a way. And then the final one is about encouraging member states to screen greenfield investments and not just merger and acquisitions. Now, I may be skeptical. I see very difficult for this to actually make the final proposal. We're just at the beginning of the negotiations. But this is just to say that a lot has changed since 2023. And if I may just conclude on, well, we can talk about outbound investments later, and we can talk about, you know, Chinese approach and etc. But what I see as a challenge for the European Union and for the UK is what has already been highlighted, which is the United States has offered a lot of momentum for many of these policies to happen and to be implemented, sometimes in collaborations and sometimes by starting first and then making that happen. And I don't see the same type of drive in the current US administration to do the same. And so I'm a little bit afraid it will be difficult for the European Union and for the UK to stay course with economic security measures.
A couple of things, again, caught my eye here. One is your discussion of economic security and protectionism, which I think is an important subject. You also highlighted that UK and Japan have difficulties in prioritizing economic security policy. But I think one of the key points you made was that economic security has a multilateral aspect. And you said that neither China nor the US can actually go it alone on economic security. So that's an interesting point, again, to explore a bit later on. So thank you, speakers, for your various views. I want to just ask each one of you a question about things that piqued my interest, and then after which we will have Q&A for the audience. I'll start with you, Ryo, if I may, and I'm going to sort of try and sweep a lot of things into this question, so do forgive me for sort of filling it up. But one, you have relations between China, the US and Japan. It's always a difficult triangle. They sort of shifted a bit, and there's a bit of a thaw going on between Japan and China. And clearly China's hedging a bit here because of what the US might do. But how does Japan sort of navigate between the sort of Charybdis and Scylla, these two difficult but really key economic interlocutors for Japan? How does it manage that? And so I'm going to sweep in a CPTPP question as well. The UK now is in the CPTPP. It's the second largest economy in the mega trade bloc by a long way. Clearly, the UK has a potential role to play here. What does, and part of that is managing China and the Indo-Pacific. What does Japan sort of hope that the UK will do with its CPTPP membership? So quite a lot in there, so for which apologies, but what do you think?
Thank you very much for that question. It is very difficult question, but as you know, Japan, China is now working very hard to fix the relationship to some extent, because China side actually start to be more nice to Japan. I say it, Chinese governments that send a kind of love call to Japan's government, seeing the Trump administration, but also their own weakness in domestic growth. So I think this is a really good moment for us to collaborate more with China. But the difficulty is, how can we encourage them toward more, I can say, structural change or structural change of Chinese economic system. Of course, we shouldn't be so tough, right, to ask a lot of things, like radical deformation of state-owned company. It might be too much, but still, we really have to ask more to Chinese government in economic policy. So for that sake, CPTPP is, of course, it could be a really good opportunity for us to talk with them. But now, and of course, UK and Japan has a really big role for that. But now, as far as I know, Costa Rica is now in the negotiation. So the real talk with China should take place, very not now, but in the future. And also with China, I think we, even though I really don't think what Japanese government is doing is economic security protectionism, but I think we really have to protect our technology from Chinese government-sponsored, investment. So I think it is very important for us to prepare kind of new mechanism to regulate FDI and also the kind of the decode technology to other side. So CPTPP is just one, but I think we still have a lot of homework, in regard to our relationship with China.
One element of economic security is making sure that this is another question for Ryo, but do jump in if you have things to add, Alexandra and Francesca. But one element of economic security is making sure that your strategic sectors are innovative and cutting edge, and the Japanese government is putting a lot of emphasis on R&D. But I look at charts in the papers, and you have China's R&D just going off the scale, and the US doing pretty well, and Japan is he's struggling against those two giants. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of the Japanese government's R&D policy? What would you like to see to make things better?
I really want to hear my colleagues' opinion on that, but I think now the government actually try to spend far more to R&D. So I think it's a kind of good sign, and they not only industrial policy like semiconductor, but they also want to spend more money for future computing, future green tech, and also future biotechnology. So, I mentioned slightly about, Japan's version of DARPA, but actually that's the size of budget for that institution is not so big. But actually the real money, real substantial money the government try to pay is as I said, computing, green tech, and sustainable energy, and also biotechnology. So, of course, it takes actually a long time, to see the real accomplishment. But as a professor working in university, I think, it is a good sign. And I really want to see more private funding too, to Japan's innovation. But I think the direction is really good now.
With any comments on R&D?
Perhaps one aspect, again, drawing on the Japan-Europe cooperation aspect, I think actually technology and research cooperation could be one area where Japan and Europe do much more together. Europe has its funding schemes, Japan has its funding schemes, and I think actually the EU now is in talks with Japan to associate it with the Horizon Europe research scheme. So I think those kind of mechanisms where we can have joint projects, we have both technological know-how on both sides. So I think putting them together would be really effective in driving the innovation.
So Alexandra, sticking with you, if I may, dual use technology. So building a resilient defense industrial base also touches on areas of economic security. Japan's new national security strategy from 2022, which I think you've written on, deals with this, and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has made this a priority area for European countries as well. And one of the areas that's of economic security that's closely linked to defense and national security, obviously, is dual use technology and AI, quantum, and so on. So a couple of questions, if I may. How has the first one, how has the policy of developing dual use technologies and regulating their export developed in Europe? You've shed some light on that. And where do you think there are the areas that Japan and the EU, UK can cooperate?
Well, I think we see with all these new technologies, critical technologies, we see that it's increasingly that the lines are being blurred even more, and what specifically, which applications may be used for the military and defense sector. So I think this is a general challenge to both Europe and Japan in terms of export controls. As I said, I think what I see in Japan is that Japan is really investing in a lot of those technologies and in developing leadership and kind of really developing key technologies in certain areas to make itself indispensable to others in the world. And I think, well, this is of implication also to the military field. I think the semiconductor or the artificial intelligence, I think as Sahashi-san has said, I think that Japan will try to work on using those new technologies also in the military field and using them for developing defense equipment. So this has implications, I think, for us in Europe as well, because we have an increasing number of joint projects in the defense field with Japan, and GCAP, the new fighter project that the UK and Italy and Japan are pursuing, I think is a good example of that. So I think those kind of the role of technology in Japan's policy has very important effects for Europe and our cooperation with Japan. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Francesca, yeah.
So if I may add a couple of things, the first one is that when we talk about dual use for a China scholar, the first thing you think about is military civil fusion. And I think the first thing that we need to clarify is that even though military civil fusion is a long-standing strategy, something that the CCP has been actively working on, is not necessarily a successful strategy as of yet. Like it's very difficult to integrate military and industrial commercial capabilities, even in countries where this strategy has been going on for a decade at this point, even longer, to be completely honest. So that is sort of point one. Point number two is that in theory, the EU included dual use technologies in export controls, if I'm not mistaken, with the review of 2021. At the same time, when the US adopted the new export controls in October 2022, that of course presented a new challenge, especially in relation to the Netherlands and the need to adopt new regulation. And this speaks to the point that I mentioned before, which is the US triggered the process that then eventually, by their own consideration, also brought countries like France to adopt new export controls in relation to the same challenges. Now, challenges for the future that I see related to export controls are for Europe especially is first and foremost the AI diffusion regulation, whether it will be kept as it is by the Trump administration is a question mark, but the AI diffusion regulation basically divides the European Union between tier 1 countries and tier 2 countries. And this is extremely complicated for a single market. The second challenge is about legacy chips, because of course, export controls of legacy chips, even now, especially now that we are thinking about the implication of DeepSeek, but anyhow, are very difficult in a block that manufactures a lot of machinery. And then finally, there will be the whole conversation about connected vehicles. What can we actually sell in the US market if that regulation indeed comes to be?
Francesca, you mentioned AI, and you've got to put us out of our misery with DeepSeek. Is this a Sputnik moment for us?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it can be in the sense of that if it puts a bit of fire in our belly, but I don't think there's any need to put fire in our belly. I do have a bit of a caveat. I'm wondering if this is the point where Europeans realize that maybe we haven't necessarily lost entirely the tech race, and there's something that can be done with less money. Now, I put a bit of a note on that. DeepSeek is definitely a success, besides, unless you don't ask DeepSeek about, Tiananmen Square or Winnie the Pooh, notably, very sensitive question on Winnie the Pooh. Is a success, but it's also at this point is unclear how much of the open models for which companies like OpenAI have spent a lot of money to train was used to train DeepSeek. So there have been reports from analysts that know a lot more than I do on the technology of AI. They're saying this 5 billion doesn't quite square. So as always with China, there's always a bit of an hype to begin with, and then in the next weeks, we'll see actually what is behind this and how much was spent and what is that. But I do want to say something related to that, which is the UK in the past has bet a lot on being one of the flagship places for AI development. And I hope this continues. And in the relationship with Japan, for example, this could be a big asset. Japan has been very successful in semiconductor production, for example, and manufacturing, also thanks to, I think you're opening a second TSMC factory, right? So one has been open and there's a second one being open. So this idea of a group of countries that together create clusters and in order to be able to produce technology. So we shouldn't all have an industrial policy that produces chips. We shouldn't all have an industrial policy that produces the same thing. But if, for example, the UK think about AI design, somebody else thinks of, it's the whole story about specialization, especially when public monies are involved.
So no Sputnik moment.
No, I don't think
No.
so. I mean, maybe next week you'll say you're wrong. Yeah, exactly. I'll lose my job, but that's my opinion.
So thank you for that, Francesca. So I want to open the questions now. I think we have a roving microphone, and we have some questions coming in online in very small print, actually. So I'll struggle reading, but anyway, I shall do my best. But any questions in the audience? Yes, at the front there. Yes. So we've got yes, go for you, and then Nicholas.
Thank you very much for very interesting introductory speech. My name is Minako Morita. I'm from University of Sussex. I'm international trade policy expert. So I'm looking at economic security issues through the lens of trade policy. So I have two questions here. One is from the trade policy perspective, economic security casts big doubt, a challenge on the global economic governance. First, in terms of the economic order, this is the, radical order shift of the 20th century style neoliberalism to more interventionist, state interventionist approach. For example, it used to be the government to support private sector or the for the efficient supply chain. That is the reason for the WTO, the FTA, using FTAs. But now the government is promoting resilient supply chain. And for the sake of that, the government intervening using the trade measures in practice. This is also relating to the second level of in practice. Trade policy measures are used for promoting economic security, such as subsidies. That completely had a kind of the challenging the WTO system, also the existing FTAs such as CPTPP, which stand on the neoliberalism, the regulation, and the laissez-faire style, market mechanism. So Professor Sahashi, you said healthy economic security collaboration. So what is healthy? So that is my first question. And then, so in that context, what the Japan, UK, and EU can do together to build the 21st century economic governance order on the post-neoliberalism? Thank you.
Let's take another question from Nicholas at the front.
Nicholas McLean, senior member at IISS. I wonder, could the panel give their views on the potential for strategic cooperation with the UK and Japan, given the huge experience the UK has had in coal decarbonization, and the fact that Japan is still very heavily dependent on coal to a surprising extent.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question from Paul in the.
Thank you. Paul Madden, independent consultant and academic. I wanted to ask a question about another aspect in which economic measures are taken, not directly for economic security or for protectionism, but in order to achieve other policy goals. So, for example, we have Europe, Japan, the US using economic sanctions to influence Russia's policies following the invasion of Ukraine. We saw China putting sanctions on Australia over policy differences. We've recently seen the new Trump administration threatening economic measures in order to enforce its migration policies. And I suspect we're going to see a lot of that as the US seeks to use its market power for a range of policy goals. I wonder how you see that fitting into this economic security debate.
Thank you, Paul. So we've a handful of questions. Perhaps each of you address the one that, all of them, if you like. Ryo, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for your question. And actually, you know, I totally agree with you. You know, it is a really critical moment for trade policy, right? And the free trade is now in crisis. I think, you know, many of my friends working in the government, especially for economic and trade industry ministry, you know, they are now in identity crisis, I believe, you know, because their career for many years, they have to be champion of free trade, but now they are very busy for, you know, economic security. So I always, you know, I worked with them, so I always hear such identity crisis issue. But I think we shouldn't be so much pessimistic because, you know, this is fast. This is reality, right? We have to find the best balance between, you know, champion as behavior as a champion of free trade and also to aim, you know, the economic growth as a nation, right? So we really have to find the best balance between the two. So, I totally agree. You know, what is healthy, what is good balance is the question. But I think, you know, the most important thing is we shouldn't, you know, do too much, you know, for our own national security, right? And actually, what Japanese government is doing now is just to select the most important area to spend money, but like, you know, in semiconductor. You know, by spending more money as a subsidy. But in other area, I think what they're doing is still within the rules of international order. So, and also, you know, they try to put a lot of emphasis on economic partnership, economic security partnership with other G7 countries. Now with United States, it is really difficult to do. But with like UK and other EU countries, you know, they are still working very well for, you know, what should be the best mix of our own national growth and rule making to sustain our economic order. So I think, you know, your question is very legitimate, but I really don't think, you know, we cannot behave just as believer of free trade only, right? So maybe we have to do a little bit more to find the good balance. But, you know, as a scholar, I always attacked by my colleague, you know, of international trade lawyers. So I really know your concern. So
Thank you, Ryo. Alexandra.
Thank you very much. I mean, the problem with economic security is that essentially we are faced with a trade-off between the goal of economic efficiency and on the other hand, kind of national security considerations. And so I think we will permanently have to try to balance between the two and seek an optimal kind of position between the two, taking into consideration both sides. And so I think that's really the challenge where we stand, is how to balance between the two. And I think that will provide in some ways the answer to healthy, but I think it's a continuous process of redefining and questioning where healthy actually is. And in that context, I think what Japan and Europe can do, I think, is really to lead that discussion precisely. What are the measures that under economic security can be viewed as, you know, legitimate concerns in terms of national security, and where does protectionism stand? I think we need a constant discussion on that, and we can, I think, use various multilateral fora to have those discussions, not just between Japan and Europe, but also to have discussions with the global South countries that may be suspecting different motives behind policies. So I think that's where we should look. We should look like at G7. We should look at WTO, even though it may be difficult, and other fora, G20, where we can have those discussions. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
So I'm no energy expert, so I'm like the others. I won't be able to answer that question. I apologize to begin with. I do have the beginning of an answer of what is a healthy economic security collaboration. I don't have as much of a problem with the fact that economic security is coming into the trade conversations, and it's not just about efficiency anymore. I have a problem with what is developing at the moment, which seems to be you have powerful economies that are developing preferential agreements in a sort of way. You have them at the center, and then they have preferential agreements with countries bilaterally, right? So you no longer have a network, and that for me is the problem. You no longer have criteria. So a while ago, if I'm not mistaken, a number of scholars proposed the adoption of economic security standards. This is a conversation that can be had multilaterally, including developing economies, including advanced economies. And these standards would have to be met by everyone in order to have access to the market. In the case of the European Union, it would be the EU market. In the case of the US, it would be the US market. And if we can agree common standards, at least then you have criteria that can be met. Now we can have a whole conversation about whether these criteria are fair or etc., but at least that is sort of a more objective standard for everyone.
Just roving, see if there's any more questions from the in-person audience, because we've got some questions online. Everyone's put their name and affiliation, which is quite unusual. So they've done what they're told. So I'm going to go to online, and we got a question from my colleague Maria Shigina, who works a lot of work on sanctions and export controls. And Maria writes from IISS, what lessons can Japan teach the EU about keeping economic security narrow and targeted? And how does Tokyo strike a balance between keeping, and I'm glad Maria's raised this, strategic indispensability, because we haven't talked about that yet, up to date without ever expanding it? And we've got a question from Fulya Ilbe. This is Fulya, Director at Infrastrategies Management Consulting based in London. Could you give some examples of the impact of economic security policies on socio-economic resilience in Japan? Obviously, that's another part of security. And Rowan Munson asks about the contribution of AI safety policy of Japan, UK, and EU, and the connection between that and economic security. So some questions there for you, but definitely let's talk about strategic indispensability.
In the context of economic security, actually what Japanese government can come up is two concepts: strategic autonomy, but this is different from what President Macron said in the context of NATO. But we use the concept strategic autonomy and also strategic indispensability. And what it means, strategic indispensability, that is, we really want to be important, in international society. by having that technology, right? So we try to specify what is our most indispensable role, right? So as I say, as in the part of the answer to the professor of Sussex, question. So, we shouldn't do too much, right? We have to specify which area we have to spend our money and resource wisely. So strategic indispensability is a really good concept, for that. So I don't know this concept is well translated in EU context, but we still use these two concepts, strategic indispensability and strategic autonomy, just to think and and also even justify our policy measures. So.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you. I think the strategic indispensability is really something that Europeans should look at and think about. I think you may know more about that. I think when the EU did kind of the risk assessment of dependencies on China, I think that part of that was also to check where China is dependent on European countries so that we know where we may have leverage or opportunities to use our leverage on China. But I think perhaps Japan's approach goes a bit further and really trying to seek to develop those indispensabilities further. As I said, with the semiconductor investments. Although I think one could make an argument that that is potentially also risky. I mean, Japan is pouring a lot of money into this chip industry, and we don't know, to what extent Japan will be successful. For example, I think one of the goals is to manufacture the top 2 or 3 nanometer semiconductor chips in Japan. Whether that will be a successful endeavor, we will know in a few years maybe. But I mean, there's a certain risk also in pouring all that money into certain sectors.
I mean, how do you view strategic indispensability as a concept? Because surely it depends on your identifying the right bit of the supply chain to focus on. What happens if, as a government, you pour lots of resources in and get the wrong bit of the supply chain?
Well, but that's the game, right? I think that what we are failing to grasp in advanced economies is that industrial policy is no guarantee. So not even for China. Of course, what comes out of China are the success cases. So those are the ones that we see. But we fail to appreciate how much money China, the Chinese state, has wasted, and they didn't go anywhere. For every BYD that comes to Europe, there have been 10 automotive companies that fail massively and that had state aid. So I think that is sort of point number one. Industrial policy is a dangerous game. And you can do it at the best of your capabilities by identifying priorities, by identifying areas where, for example, investments are already coming in. So there's commercial viability for those areas. By, for example, in the case of Japan and semiconductors, objectively, geographically, Taiwan is close to Japan. So Taiwan TSMC engineers can go to the Japanese plants and help with the technology transfer and etc. Thing that, for example, couldn't happen in the case of the plant in Dresden, right? So that is a bit more of a challenge. So there are criteria to help the success of industrial policies, but we should never be under the impression that this is a guarantee that is going to succeed. And I just wanted to quickly, I just realized we haven't really answered your question. The idea that the UK, Japan, and the EU are able to get some standard and have a multilateral conversation should also be a way to mitigate the use of economic statecraft as a lever to change home and foreign policy, right? So the idea of creating a system where there are some standards at least being discussed is exactly at the basis of this, to avoid that economic security is used as argument to even mention that you may want to acquire Greenland, right? Which was the case in that particular speech. So that is why, these were 2 points that I connected, but yeah, that's it.
No, yeah. Also, relating to that question, we shouldn't let, especially United States, to use economic security as an excuse for economic nationalism, right? Really good example is Nippon Steel, of course, investment too, failed investment too, U.S. Steel. You know, they said it is not economic security. They say it is national security issue, but this is just abuse of the concept and abuse of our policies, right? So we should, UK, EU, and Japan, these countries really should work more hard to have kind of standard, right? This area we can, share the same goal and the same criteria. If not, we will be just trapped by economic nationalism. It is really, really bad for our prosperity. So.
Thank you, Ryo. We are out of time, and I've been a terrible chair because we're now 1 minute over what I promised. So apologies to everybody. Francesca, you mentioned TSMC, and if anyone is wanting a holiday in Japan, which of course we all are, do go down to Kyushu, to Kikuyo. My father-in-law lives in Kikuyo, and he took me to see the fab. And it's quite extraordinary what industrial policy has done on that bit of Japan. I've been going there for 30 years, and it had a bit of light industry, but it's nothing like it is now. It's quite extraordinary how positive industrial policy has been. And it's also very close to Mount Aso, which I think is one of the most beautiful parts of the planet. So a plug there for Kyushu. So just to conclude then, my takeaways, one was the importance of multilateralism in economic security, and Alexandra mentioned G7, which I'm sure will go through more iterations as we go forward, but even the WTO. Another one was the importance of prioritizing economic security policy, which I think requires us to define what we mean by economic security a bit more tightly. Then, Ryo, you mentioned the link between economic security and competitiveness. I think this is something I'm certainly going to try and think more about. And I also liked, like, another plug for your idea of the Global Forum for Economic Security that Japan and the UK will lead. I think that's a great idea. IISS, of course, very willing to help out here. So what a fantastic way, sort of in the spirit of collaboration. Thank you, audience, for being so active and for coming, and thank you, online audience, for your questions as well. We'll have a recording of this event available on the IISS website and perhaps Japan House website as well in the next day or so. If you have any further questions on anything we've talked about, do ask me, and we'll do our best to help you. And thank you, of course, Japan House, this wonderful venue, and the warmth of your support as well. Everything's seamless, which is just how we like it. And thanks, of course, to the IISS events team and comms team and tech team as well. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you. And please give our speakers a warm round of applause.